Well, one of the things I really enjoy about this series and looking at the heroes of faith in Hebrews 11 is that I get to remember when I was a kid and would go to Sunday school and would hear the stories of those heroes. I liked the ones in the New Testaments, but there's something about the Old Testament ones that I really loved. I think it was because they helped capture my imagination as a kid and made me believe that things were possible, that there was an adventure that was waiting. And as an adult, I think so often we're so inclined to study passages of scriptures for like different interpretations of words and meanings, and to talk about the inspiration of a passage or how that was understood. And I think there is great value in actually pausing and remembering the stories of people just like us who were called to do remarkable things, to be active in their faith. Because those people were flawed human beings just like you and I. And they had to get up every day and try to live their faith out. And we need to do that. We desperately need to live out our faith. And it's like we need umption in our gumption. My spell checker doesn't know how to use that word. But I know it's a thing because my mom taught it to me. That I need umption to get going, to do, to try, to live it out. And that's really what the message of Hebrews is about, as the book focuses and tries to talk to people, calling them to faith in a very real way. And the writer of Hebrews gets to chapter 11 and he says, remember all of those who came before you. And he tells us these stories, reminds us with just their name to recall the life that they lived. And so today we get to look at another one of my favorite people to talk about Gideon. Because Gideon is unique. Well, not really. He's pretty ordinary, actually. Does anybody remember why Gideon? You remember the story in Sunday school? Why Gideon is, amazing? No one? It's okay. He's going to take some men and go into battle. Remember? But he has too many. So God keeps telling him to narrow down. He needs fewer people. And if you're Gideon, you got to be thinking, this is nuts. Gideon is a portrait in fear. That's really what I see when I look at Gideon. And the remarkable thing that God will do in the story that you probably remember, it doesn't start there, of course. We'll get to Gideon's beginning in a minute, but I want you to hang on to that this is a portrait of fear. And God will take Gideon, who is, to put it mildly, a fraidy cat. And God will do something remarkable because of Gideon's unwilling but still obedient action. God will cause the enemy to kill themselves in fear. And Gideon appears in the story in a remarkable way, a man who is living in a time of fear. The Israelites have taken possession of the promised land, but they're certainly not living the promised life. The Israelites have broken God's laws. They have turned away from worshiping God alone, and they've actually begun to worship idols, and they've set idols up around the kingdom, and they're bowing down and worshiping false gods instead of worshiping God alone. And God has punished them, and he does it by allowing the enemies of God's people to become raiders of the countryside, stealing the food that they gather to try to live. God allows the enemies of Israel to plunder them. And yet God promises that he's going to do something remarkable. So God has allowed the people to experience some hardship. And Gideon, as the story begins in Judges chapter 6, this is what we read. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of slavery in Egypt and rescued you from the Egyptians and from all who oppressed you.
I drove out your enemies and gave you their land. I told you, I am the Lord your God. You must not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you now live, but you have not listened to me." And so God brings a punishment on the land. But God is a loving Father who does not give up on his children, and he intends to still do what he has promised to do. And so he intends to rescue Israel again from the enemies that plunder them. And so God keeps his promise even when we are not faithful. Then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the oak tree at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash in the clan of Bezer. Gideon, son of Joash, had been threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "Mighty hero, the Lord is with you." "Sir," Gideon replied, "if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say the Lord brought us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites." Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you." "But Lord," Gideon replied, "how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least of my entire family." And the Lord said to him, "I will be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man." The simple truth is, Gideon doesn't believe he is a hero. He's just a farmer, and he's afraid. Gideon does not believe the Lord. He doubts God's promises. Isn't that obvious in the text? If you're so great and you promise to rescue us, what's going on? And he is afraid. Fear and doubt move in. And when that happens to us, we respond by pulling away. We hide. And that's exactly what Gideon does. He is exactly like us. He is at the bottom of a winepress, hiding so that he can get some wheat, knowing his enemy will steal it from him if they see him. Gideon is just like us, ordinary and afraid. But we are not ordinary. Not really. We are just looking at the wrong reality, a false reality. Gideon, you see, was chosen, given a mission. That's what made him special. He was chosen. We are chosen, given a mission, a purpose, a future. And we have to focus instead on that reality. Not the one we think we know, but the one that really is. And we have to run after Christ. That's what the writer in Hebrews is telling us. We have to fix our eyes on Jesus and be about the mission in front of us. And so God speaks and says, "Go in the strength you have." And Gideon is given no small assignment. And I don't blame Gideon for doubting. Do you? The Midianites have a huge army. He has no weapons. Gideon doesn't even have an army yet. He doesn't have any special abilities to prove to his fellow Israelites that he's really an agent of God. He just has a story about some guy at a tree who told him to go. And so Gideon wants a sign, and he does this weird thing. He runs and makes some unleavened bread, and he gets some meat to make a sacrifice, and he comes back. Gideon replied, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me." He might even think he's delusional. But who is he? This can't be real. "Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you." Then the Lord said, "I will wait until you return." Gideon went in, prepared a young goat, and from an ephah of flour he made bread without yeast. Putting the meat in a basket and its broth in a pot, he brought them out and offered them to him under the oak. The angel of God said to him, "Take the meat and the unleavened bread, place them on this rock, and pour out the broth." And Gideon did so. with the tip of the staff that was in his hand. The angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. When Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, "Ah, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." Gideon wasn't brave. He wanted a sign. He's going to actually ask for a few. He's going to keep doubting. Even after seeing this amazing scene, he will again and again ask God over and over to prove it. He does, in obedience, go out and tear down the idols around the country at night so no one can see him because he's afraid. He isn't brave at all. Gideon is flawed. He's a doubting child. And yet God still uses him to do great things. Not because Gideon is something wondrous, but because God is. That's the point of the story. Gideon, he looked in a mirror and he saw a farmer from an insignificant family. And he saw himself as the least of his family in a weak tribe. In fact, a disobedient tribe. A tribe that had given up more often than it had succeeded. And he saw himself as a member of a people who didn't really trust God. He had lots of reasons to doubt. He had lots of reasons to look around and see the enemy's vast army and to question whether or not there could ever be a rescue. And Gideon knows one thing. In fact, he's grown up with it his whole life. Fear. This is a portrait in fear. You see, God is calling somebody who knows they can't succeed. It can't happen. It won't happen. It doesn't happen. And yet God invites Gideon to, instead of looking at fear and what he is sure will come about, to believe instead that God has a different outcome in mind, one that turns the tables and reverses things. The difference between Gideon's success and Gideon's failure is a simple thing. It's not Gideon's strength, it's the promise of God. That God says, go and do this. And I'm with you. You have enough to do what I'm asking you to do. Go. And it's why this moment for me is special, this unleavened bread and this sacrifice of this meat, this fire that consumes it. Because it reminds me again that God in Jesus has already made the sacrifice. He has already extended the offering. He's already promised to be present. You are empowered not because you're so talented. I don't mean to shake your world up. Sorry, Steve. You are not empowered by your greatness, by your intelligence. You're not empowered by your wealth. You're not empowered by your health. You're not empowered by your reputation, your family, or even the country that you live in. You are empowered by one thing alone. The Spirit of God present in you because of what Jesus has already done. And that power, that spirit is not a spirit of fear. And we have to be reminded of that. That the reality is that God stands right there, the shadow of the cross in the light of the empty tomb, already telling us we are saved. We are empowered. The promise has already been kept. That's the reality that we live in. I know that we don't see that one. We see all of the problems and the hurts, the anxieties, the stresses, the things we can't control. But God has already spoken. He's already announced. And he says so clearly, go in the strength you have. You see, God has already performed the sign. He's already done all of those things that he's promised to do. And each one of us has already been equipped and prepared, given exactly what we need to accomplish whatever task God is putting in front of us. The challenge before us is to actually believe more in the power of God than we believe in the challenges we face. To actually admit, God, I'm afraid. And to allow God in that moment to respond and do what he has done so many times. Gideon, if you read the rest of his story, like I said, he's going to ask for more signs. The people are going to get mad at him for what he's done. They're going to surround his house and want to kill him. He's going to want a sign. He's going to get an army, yes, finally, and God's going to weed it out. And God is going to defeat the Midianites. It's so nice when we can read a story that we know and know the outcome. Do you know the outcome of the story that you're living in right now? You will close your eyes. And when you open them, the glory of God will be revealed. And it'll happen in a flash. And I know that there's a lot between now and then. But we already know the end of the story that we're in. And it's understandable as human beings that we give in to fear and we doubt. But isn't it amazing that we have a God who does not condemn us because of our fear, who instead empowers us through his Spirit to overcome? That's the promise that God has made. And I want to remind you about the mission that he gave you, the one that you're called to go and do. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. I know that sometimes that we think of this simply as a global kind of mission of the church, and we can hire people and do things, but I think that this is really your mission in your life. I really believe that. I believe that you are called to be obedient to everything that Christ has taught you, but I think you're in turn supposed to turn and teach that to others. And that you do it in your life. And yes, it's a very scary thing. It is a frightening world because you know how people will treat you. And the fear can be overwhelming. But I want to remind you, you see, we just mentioned his name, Gideon. He rescued Israel. Not because he had swords to fight the battle, but because in his fear, God took his simple offering and willingness to be obedient, and he turned the tables, and the enemy was defeated because of their own fear. And God can do that in your life, can use your simple offering to reverse the circumstances around you, to transform the lives of the people that you love. It requires a willingness to be obedient, to hear God and go. To understand that we're supposed to operate in the strength that he provides. To use the gifts that he gives us. To allow ourselves to be about his work, to be about the cause of Christ. You can if you choose, stand in the strength and power of God. And you can, if you choose, speak with the very words of God. And you can, if you choose, remove the obstacles that prevent people from believing the message. And you can, if you want, remind yourself that there was a man you met at a tree who sacrificed himself for you so that you could live forever with God. That Jesus Christ died, willingly sacrificing himself so that our sin is no longer held against us, but we instead are the people of God, claimed by his name, that we can go and share the good news of who Jesus is and what he has done, and empower each and every one of us to live for the kingdom of God. If you're here this morning and you have never confessed that Jesus Christ is Lord, I would encourage you to come forward and do that while we sing. That you would confess that Jesus is the Son of God, that you would be baptized in his name for the remission of sin and the gift of the Holy Spirit, that you would begin to live your life for God. Let God defeat fear in your life and empower you to serve him. And if you're a believer, and sometimes we just need to be reminded of what we believe, to speak the words again and claim the promise of God. Whatever your need is this morning, if you'll make it known, we would love to encourage you and strengthen you. Let's stand together and sing.